The snail business nobody noticed at Diddley Squat. A storm tore through Diddley Squat Farm in the latest run of episodes, and in the chaos that followed, one small detail got completely overshadowed by everything else happening on screen. It might quietly be worth more than the beer. It started with wrecked buildings. It ended with roughly 1,000 snails living in a barn. And somewhere in between, Lisa Hogan stepped into a beauty industry worth billions of pounds, using a creature most people spend money trying to get rid of. So today we're asking the question nobody covering this story has actually sat down to answer. Is this a gimmick bill for the cameras? Or is it the smartest move Diddley Squad has made since the beer first hit shelves? Stick with us, because by the end of this, we think you'll see why this deserves to be taken far more seriously than a 2-minute joke in episode 6. The setup, quick catch-up for anyone who hasn't seen the latest series. The storm damages several structures on the farm, including the shelter the sheep normally use. Clarkson's first instinct is obvious. Move the flock into the new barn. Lisa shuts that down immediately. Something's already living in there. What she hasn't mentioned, until now, is that something is close to 1,000 snails, which she's been quietly breeding in secret. Not for food, for their slime. In the beauty industry, that slime has a name, mucin. On screen, it plays as a throwaway gag. A few seconds of confusion, a laugh, and the show moves on to the next disaster. But this isn't really a new obsession appearing out of nowhere. Clarkson has talked publicly, in a completely separate context, about eating snail caviar, something he picked up after coming off Ozempic, describing it as the most expensive food on earth, costing more per mouthful than cocaine. So this random barn subplot is actually the next chapter of something that's been sitting quietly in the background of this farm story for a while. It's just never been turned into an actual product line before. And that's exactly what we want to dig into. Strip away the 45 minutes of television, put this next to the real numbers behind the global beauty industry, and find out whether it can survive as an actual business. Why this isn't a small story. Here's a number that turns this from a passing mention into something worth a full investigation. South Korea's cosmetics industry is worth roughly $7 billion. Snail mucin isn't some obscure byproduct buried inside that figure. It's one of the industry's most recognizable signature exports. It gets dedicated shelf space in Boots and in Sephora, and it shows up consistently on Amazon skincare bestseller lists. In the UK specifically, snail mucin as a search term pulls in roughly 20,000 searches a month. That's not a trend that spikes for 6 weeks and vanishes. That's a returning, paying customer base that's been building steadily for years. So when Lisa Hogan starts farming a barn full of snails in Oxfordshire, she isn't messing around with something niche or experimental. She's walking straight into one of the more established, higher-value corners of a genuinely global industry, the ingredient Britain never built a machine for. It's worth knowing where this trend actually came from, because the origin story explains exactly why Britain has been so far behind on it. Snail secretions in skincare weren't invented in Korea. The earliest commercial use is generally traced back to a Chilean brand, built on a simple observation. Farm workers who handle garden snails by hand seem to end up with noticeably softer skin over time. It was South Korean cosmetics companies, roughly a decade later, who took that observation and turned it into a global category, backed by serious processing infrastructure and an export machine built specifically to move skincare worldwide. That's the piece that's been missing in Britain the entire time. Plenty of countries eat snails. France and Italy have farmed them for food for centuries. But almost nobody outside Korea ever built the cosmetic processing side of that business at scale. The raw ingredient has been sitting there this whole time. Nobody built the machine to turn it into a product. And that's precisely the gap this farm now appears to be stepping into, where the real money actually sits. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the markup on this category is extraordinary, and almost nobody buying the finished bottle ever stops to think about where that markup actually lives. A single snail, on its own, is worth almost nothing. Farm it specifically for mucin, extract the slime, filter it, stabilize it, and at that stage it's still a relatively low-value raw commodity. But once that same material gets formulated into a serum, bottled, branded, and put on a shelf, it starts retailing anywhere from around £11 at a budget end up to £28 or more for premium versions. That gap between what the raw material is worth and what the finished, branded bottle sells for is essentially the entire business model behind Korean beauty's biggest export categories. The ingredient itself becomes almost incidental. The brand name, the packaging, the story wrapped around it. That's where nearly all the value actually sits. Which raises the obvious question. If a garden pest can fund that kind of margin for an established Korean export brand, why has no British farm meaningfully entered this market before now? The barrier that's kept everyone else out. The honest answer, heliciculture, commercial snail farming, barely exists as a real industry in this country. It's mostly been treated as a hobbyist curiosity, or occasionally a niche product for high-end restaurants. There's no established UK supply chain feeding raw mucin into cosmetics the way there's across parts of Europe and East Asia. And there's a regulatory dimension here that's easy to overlook, but it might be the single most important part of this whole story. Snails can carry parasites and bacteria, including salmonella, if they aren't farmed and processed under proper controls. This isn't a stick a snail in a jar and sell it operation. It has to meet the same food safety and cosmetic safety standards as any other regulated product hitting shop shelves: refrigeration, sterilization, batch testing. The exact same bureaucratic weight that any farm shop owner watching this will recognize instantly from their own paperwork. That's a barrier that's quietly kept smaller British producers locked out of this market for over a decade, while the Korean brands that built their processing infrastructure years ago keep dominating nearly every shelf in every major UK retailer. It's a familiar pattern to anyone who's followed how British food regulation tend to play out. A perfectly viable product idea, stalled for years, not because it doesn't work, but because nobody's built a compliant infrastructure to bring it to market legally and safely at scale. The one advantage no other British farm has. Here's the part that changes the calculation specifically for this farm. Unlike literally any other British producer trying the exact same thing, Diddley Squat doesn't need to build a beauty brand from scratch and spend years earning trust. It already has one, built entirely by the show. The farm shop has already sold out product lines that had nothing to do with traditional farming, including a perfume range that got torn apart online for its branding and packaging, and still sold through within days regardless. Nobody was buying that perfume because the bottle looked premium. They bought it because it said Diddley Squat on the front. That name alone was enough to move stock. That's the real asset in play here. Not the snails, the name attached to them, how the extraction actually works. It's worth pausing on how this slime is actually collected, because it's one of the most common questions people raise, and it genuinely affects whether a venture like this can be marketed comfortably to a British audience. The more reputable producers in this space, the ones supplying major Korean brands, use what's generally described as a stress-free extraction method. Snails are placed in a clean, quiet enclosure and left to move freely across a fine mesh surface for roughly half an hour at a time. As they move, they naturally secrete mucin onto the mesh, which is then collected without the animal being harmed, squeezed, or subjected to anything resembling the older, cruder methods that gave this industry a bad name early on. That detail matters commercially because animal welfare concerns have genuinely sunk skincare ingredient before. Any British version of this business will need to be transparent about exactly this point from day one, or risk the same backlash that's hit other novel ingredients in the past. The competition Diddley Squat would be walking into. It's also worth naming who's actually standing in the way here, rather than talking about the Korean beauty industry as one vague block. The dominant name on UK shelves in this category is COSIX, whose advanced snail mucin power essence has become something close to the default reference point for the entire ingredient. It's the product most British skincare buyers have either tried themselves or seen recommended in nearly every review of this category going. That's both a problem and an opportunity for a new entrant. The problem is obvious. COSIX has years of brand trust, clinical backing, and shelf placement that a farm shop product simply doesn't have yet. The opportunity is that COSIX's entire appeal rests on being a slightly clinical, slightly anonymous Korean import. No personality, no face, no story beyond the ingredient itself. Diddley Squat's version will be the exact opposite, a known, slightly chaotic, very British story attached to a category currently dominated by faceless efficiency. Whether British buyers actually want personality over clinical credibility in their skincare is a genuinely open question, and it's one this farm is about to test in public, on television, whether it meant to or not. A pattern this channel has seen before. If you've watched this channel for a while, this story should feel familiar, because we've covered this exact shape more than once already. Go back to our breakdown of the £8 million beef business, How Diddley Squat outsmarted every supermarket doing the same thing. Same underlying pattern. Take an unglamorous, ordinary agricultural product, attach it to the brand built around one man's farm, and watch the margins behave completely differently than they would for anyone else selling the identical physical product. Oh, look at the pub. Printing money largely because of the name attached to it, rather than because it's doing anything especially unusual as a business. Or Caleb's roughly £1 million contracting operation. Riding partly on visibility, the show gave him that no other young contractor in his position would ever get. It worked with Hawkstone, when a beer most people assumed was a novelty tie-in ended up carving out real shelf space against industry giants. It worked with the beef. It's working, to varying degrees, with the pub. The question this video is actually trying to answer is whether it works with slime, where this could realistically fall apart. We want to be fair here, because not every Diddley Squat venture has landed cleanly, and it's worth being upfront about exactly where this one could stumble. Scale. 1,000 Snail sounds like a lot until you compare it to what an established Korean processing facility handles in a single week. Even accounting for how quickly a breeding operation like this can grow, reports have put the figure as high as 8,000 snails. This is, at best, a small batch, farm shop scale operation in its current form. Scaling beyond that requires investment in proper extraction and processing infrastructure that doesn't currently exist on this farm, or really anywhere in Britain at any meaningful scale. That's not a small hurdle. That's a kind of capital investment that turns a charming farm shop product into an actual business line. And right now, there's no public sign that investment is being made. Public squeamishness. Snail caviar already sounds unusual enough that Clarkson made a joke of it in his own newspaper column. A skincare product harvested from garden snails is a noticeably tougher sell to a mainstream British shopper than it is in Korea, where snails are already woven into both culinary and skincare culture. That cultural gap is real, and no amount of clever branding fully erases it. People in Seoul grew up around this ingredient. People in Oxfordshire largely didn't, and some of them will need convincing, not just curiosity. Novelty fatigue. This might be the one that matters most in the long run. The farm shop has launched plenty of products off the back of a television moment before, and not all of them have had staying power once the initial wave of curious buyers moved on to whatever the show introduced next. The real test isn't whether this sells in the first month, while the Storm episode is still fresh in everyone's mind. It's whether anyone's still buying it in 18 months, once nobody's talking about that episode anymore, and the shelf space has to justify itself on repeat purchases rather than curiosity. That's a test almost every novelty farm shop product eventually fails, because curiosity is a one-time purchase driver, and skincare specifically depends on repeat custom to ever become genuinely profitable, rather than just a fun line for one Christmas season. The bigger picture underneath the joke. There's a broader pattern we're sitting with here, because this isn't really an isolated story about one farm and one unusual product. British agriculture as a whole has been pushed, often by necessity rather than choice, toward exactly this kind of diversification. Traditional income from crops and livestock alone has been under sustained pressure for years. Input costs, policy changes, and supermarket buying power that squeezes margins at the farm gate. What we're watching at Diddley Squat, the beer, the pub, the beef, and now potentially the skincare line, is one of the more visible, almost exaggerated versions of survival strategy that quieter farms across the country are being forced into in smaller, far less telegenic ways. The difference is that almost nobody else gets a television show and 5 seasons of brand building to make that pivot actually work. That's the real advantage hiding underneath all the slime jokes. The baseline that explains everything. It's worth remembering exactly how far this farm has come, because it puts a Snail venture in proper perspective. By Clarkson's own account, the very first season of this farm, run purely on traditional arable farming, no shop, no pub, no beer, certainly no skincare, returned a profit of just over £100 for an entire year's work across roughly 1,000 acres. That number is the baseline every single decision since then has to be measured against. Every diversification this farm has attempted, however small or strange it might look from the outside, exists specifically because that starting number was so catastrophically thin that almost anything was worth trying. A barn full of breeding snails looks a lot less eccentric once you remember the farm it's sitting on once made less money in 12 months than most people spend on a weekly supermarket shop. Addressing the obvious eye roll. We should address the skepticism some of you are already typing into the comments, because it's a completely fair reaction. Yes, It sounds like a joke. Yes, the instinct to roll your eyes at a multimillionaire TV presenter's farm now selling snail slime is entirely understandable. But notice, the same reaction greeted the beer when it first launched, and the same reaction greeted the farm shop sausages. In both cases, the eye-rolling didn't stop either product from selling, or from generating genuine recurring revenue once the initial mockery died down. On this farm, mockery and commercial viability have turned out to be almost entirely unrelated. So where does this actually land? After going through the real numbers, rather than just reacting to the headline the way most coverage of this story did, this isn't purely a gimmick dreamed up for the cameras. The market is real. The margins are real. The demand, 20,000 UK searches a month, sustained, is real. What isn't proven yet is whether 1,000 snails in an Oxfordshire barn can scale into something that actually moves a farm's bottom line, rather than producing one strong television moment before quietly disappearing from the shelf within a year, the way a few earlier product experiments arguably have. Our honest prediction, this becomes a genuine, ongoing farm shop product line. Strong margins, modest volume, sold most of the people who've watched the show and want a tangible piece of it. Not the next Hawkstone in terms of scale, but also not nothing, and certainly not the most far-fetched thing this farm has ever successfully turned into cash. If we're wrong, it's likely because the processing and safety overhead turns out to be more expensive than the novelty value justifies, and it quietly fades away some farm shop experiments do once the cameras move on to the next storyline. The chapter most coverage miss entirely. One more angle worth raising before we close this out, because it tends to get lost in the rush to cover the headline. If this product line finds real, sustained demand, the genuinely interesting next chapter isn't selling it in British farm shops at all. It's the possibility of eventually exporting a British-grown version of an ingredient the UK currently imports almost entirely from Korea. That would flip the entire trade relationship on its head, turning a farm that started this show producing barley and rapeseed into one quietly competing in the same export category as a country that effectively invented the modern version of this industry. That's a long way off, and we're not suggesting it's likely within the next year or two. But it's the kind of long-term upside that makes a story worth tracking properly, rather than dismissing after one episode's worth of jokes. What this really tells us, beyond just this one farm, is something worth sitting with. If a Cotswolds operation can plausibly compete in even a small corner of a billion-pound Korean export category using an animal most gardeners are actively trying to kill, that says something significant about how far the gap has opened between traditional farm income and what's now genuinely possible once a farm has built a strong enough brand behind it. 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been a viable business conversation for any working farm in Britain. Today, it clearly is, and that's arguably the biggest story sitting underneath the Snail headline that most coverage of this completely missed. Tell us what we should dig into next. The pub's actual finances since it opened? The real numbers behind Hawkstone's growth against the bigger brews? Or something else happening on the farm right now that hasn't had a proper deep dive yet? Drop it below. We say this every time, and we mean it every time. We read every single comment. Take care of yourselves. See you in the next one.